All right, so welcome back, everybody, and let's continue our discussion about OAuth. So we just saw a brief demonstration of how OAuth works. If it's the first time really seeing how viewing it, it can feel a little complicated. So do feel free to go back over the slides and start by taking a look at this simple OAuth demo, which is just a single application that talks along with the browser to GitHub to kind of exchange, to get authorization, exchange code for token, and then use the token to get user information. All right. The code is small enough that it can, for the most part, fit onto a single page if that's all you want to do with OAuth, okay? And then I've kind of broken it down step by step one more time so that you can kind of see how it goes. All right. So let's talk about our application. All right. So our application is a little bit more complicated because um, our application actually has two parts to it. It's got an application, which is the one talking to the browser, and then it's got an API, and that's the one that has access to the resources that we want. Okay. And thus far, it's been our API that has done most of the heavy lifting, most of the access and talking to external resources like SendGrid, the database, and others. And our web application, for the most part, its only job is to talk to the web browser. So it's just mainly to dish out pages that the web browser can render. That's all it really does so far. So, um, but we do have to ask a couple of questions now. One of which is, which of these two entities, the web application or the API, should, you know, redirect, doing all the redirecting, handling the code, the one-time password, the code that comes back, get the access token, get the account information. Like, who should be doing all these things? It's not easily clear. All right. And that's the reason I say it's not easily clear, because it's tempting to just say, oh, let the web API do everything. But we know this week the web API cannot do everything, because we do have to redirect this browser and handle stuff like the callback URL with the code that's coming in through the browser. And it's our web application who talks to the browser. So the web API just cannot do everything. The web application has to be involved. The question is, should the web API be involved or not, right? So who should kind of take part in this whole process? So let's take a look at some options. And regrettably, there's no one way to do this. So I'm going to look at three options, and I'm going to pick one way to do my application. I might leave you with some freedom about how you do your application, okay? But let's take a look at one way, at a few ways that we could kind of do OAuth with a system that has both a web application and an API. All right. Let's begin. All right. Um, here's here's one possible solution, and I'm going to call it solution one. Solution one is forget the API. Just use the web application to do everything. All right. Which means GitHub has no knowledge of my API. It will never talk to my API. It's my web application who is registered with a client ID and client secret with GitHub. All right. And it knows the scope. It will receive the code in the callback, and it will use that code to get the access token and get account information from GitHub. So basically, with solution one, the way it would work is that, and I'll provide two more solutions, but with solution one, the browser would, we would redirect the browser to go log in. The application would redirect the browser to go log in with GitHub. GitHub would do the authorization with the browser. That's the same. And then GitHub would issue a callback with a code. And my callback, I could set it up so that it comes back to my web application. And my web application now would use the client ID and the client secret that it knows because it alone is registered with GitHub. And it would use a code that comes back with the callback, and it would exchange it with an access token. And then it would use the access token to get information from GitHub. So now the web application would know all the information about the user, and it could now go tell the web API, hey, I would like to make a new user account for somebody with GitHub credentials. All right. This is solution one. I'm calling it like the web app only solution. My API does nothing. All right. It's my web application who does everything with GitHub. And if I have to log the user in now, I have to tell later, after all these steps, the web application will tell the API, hey, I got a whole bunch of information about a user from GitHub. Here's the information. All right. Any downsides to this solution? Can anybody suggest any like problem with this solution, or can we just do this solution? Any thoughts? What's that? Brandon, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and you can unmute yourself and speak if you wish. Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, right. So Brandon's right. For every web client, we'd have to duplicate this process. That's absolutely true. Um, but you know, Brandon, I don't know if there's a workaround for that problem. Because is it possible for my web API to be the client? Maybe it is. Okay, so I get your point. So Brandon's saying every time I have this one web application. What if I had like 2 or 3 web applications that all use this API? Each one of them would have to go ahead and create a client ID and a client secrets. All right. Okay, so that's definitely a concern. Okay, I got your concern, loud and clear. Any other concerns anybody has? Brandon, I'll lower your hand unless you have another question. But feel free to raise it again if you have a question. But anybody else have or Brandon again if you wish. Anybody else have any other concerns? I have a concern. We're talking about web applications. What if I was doing something like this, but through a mobile app? Would my, like, imagine this wasn't a browser and a web application. This was like just both of these were a mobile app. Would my mobile app have to register a client ID and a client secret and use the code to and get an access token and I mean, that's a lot to ask a mobile app to do. And the reason I say this is because when I distribute my mobile app on the App Store, it would come embedded with a client ID and a client secret in it. That just seems a little scary. Brandon, go ahead. All right, good point. So if I made a mobile app, my mobile app would have to actually, if I wanted to do it this way, I would have to have a web application that works with my mobile app to do the OAuth anyway. So that's possibly, yeah, that would be one way to do it for sure. Okay, and that would mean my mobile app would have to have another. I would have to have a web application that corresponds to my mobile app. All right. Okay. So there's a couple of things that makes this thing a little bit this solution alone a little bit unfriendly. So let's see some other potential solutions. Okay, here's another solution. This is, I call it solution number 2. In solution number 2, my web application still does everything. However, it doesn't have the client ID and client secret. It doesn't know those things. I register my web API with GitHub. Okay, so what I'm basically trying to do this time is I'm trying to offload as much work to my API as possible. Okay, so so what would have to happen now is my web application would send the browser to GitHub. GitHub would do all the authorization, and the callback would have to come to my web application anyway. It cannot go to my API because somebody has to, like, redirect the website to the next page and the next page. So the web application has to do that. So maybe what I could do this time is my web application would get the code, and it could send the code to the web API, and now the web API would use the code that it got from the web application to use the client ID, client secret, and everything, and get the token, and then use the token to get the resources. So essentially, I'm trying to hand over everything that I can to the web API. But I can't hand over everything because remember, this button here, this sign in with GitHub button, this button right here, that button needs to it needs to be a link that sends the browser to GitHub, and that link needs the client ID and the scope. So it seems that my web application would have to know the client ID. Another way is maybe I don't hard code the client ID in the web application, but maybe my web application can make a GET request to my web API when it needs to render this page and say, hey, what's your client ID? And then it could set up the correct button with the correct link in it without having to hard code the client ID into the application and also into my API. Okay, so this is another solution in which I'm trying to get the API to do as much as possible. But unfortunately, this button with the link, which has the client ID and the scope in the link, to send the user to GitHub, I do need a client ID. And maybe the way to do it is to kind of get the client ID from the web API. So still, the web API knows everything and has a relationship with GitHub, and any other applications could ask the API, hey, I would like to do single sign-on. Could you give me the client ID and maybe the scope and other things? Okay. The callback URL, it would have to go to a web application anyway. You cannot send the callback to an API because then the browser won't know what to do next. Unless the API was to then redirect the user back to the application, but that's complicated because there could be multiple applications. So it gets complicated, okay? So the application would have to handle the callback anyway. And then it would get the code, and it would send the code to the API, and the API would then use the code and its secrets to get the token and resources. So this is solution number 2. Is it better than solution number 1? Hold on, let me go back to single page. Is it better? Okay, so so there's some trade-offs. Yeah, so Brandon, you can unmute yourself and tell me what you think some trade-offs might be. Or if you just want to generally say there are trade-offs. Yeah, right. So that's true. I mean, before I can even render this login page, forget GitHub, just to show this page, I would have to make a quick call to the API and say, hey, can you give me your client ID so that I can create the link appropriately? So it would, there's a lot of back and forth. That's absolutely true. And that is regrettable, right? Okay. Let me go to one more solution and let me see if this solution is any better. So in this solution, the web application is like solution number 1 basically, because the web application is the one that's registered with GitHub, and it has the client ID and the client secret. It gets the code, okay, and what it could do is it could also use the code to get the token, and then it could pass the token onto the API, and the API could use the token to receive resources. Okay, so now, and by the way, the API may have to access GitHub multiple times in the future, but it can do that. It would not need the application again. The API could make this request and more requests later with the token alone. All right. So in this case, I'm kind of going back to solution number one. But the only thing I'm doing differently here is instead of getting the resources and account data and other things from GitHub directly with the access token, the application tells the API, listen, you're the boss. Here's the token. Go ahead, get whatever resources you want. All right. So on the one hand, we have minimized a little bit of back and forth from solution number two, but the web API is a little bit more involved. So there's more code to write in multiple applications than solution number one. All right. Whew. Unfortunately, I mean, and there might be some more options. I've shown you three solutions. There might be more solutions. And I'd love to hear from somebody who say, no, 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 I've got a better one. I'd love to hear that because I don't like any of them, frankly. Okay. But we have to pick one of them. At least I have to pick one of them to do my application for this semester. Okay. So let's take a look at what could be some ups and downs. So let's take a look at them again and let's think about it, okay? So solution number one, API does everything is great, but the problem is if later on our API needs to get some information from GitHub at a later date, it can't do it because in solution number one, only the web application had access to everything. So the API is forever shut out from talking to GitHub. So that's a downside, and I don't like that solution for that reason, because I would like my API to in future be able to behind the scene, maybe like in a future date, I need to contact GitHub again to be like, hey, is this user still there? Like, should I delete them from my database? Is this still a GitHub user? I may need to do some checks like that later on. So it may not be safe for the application to do everything, right? Not to mention the API, finally, when it gets the account information, it has to trust the web application to provide whatever the hell it wants. The web API has no way of knowing if later the account information coming from the web application really came from GitHub or not, because it's just getting all the account information from the web application. So my API is kind of like just has to trust the application to do everything with GitHub. So I'm not a big fan of solution number one for this reason. I cannot integrate my API into talking to GitHub later, and my API has no way of verifying that this information is coming from GitHub. Um, what if somebody hacked into my web application and I don't know, it's just giving my API fraudulent information about the account or other resources? My API would never know with solution number one. So I don't like solution number one. It is the easiest solution, though, which makes it very hard for me to say, no, I'm not going to do it, because it would be the easiest one to code. It would look exactly like my OAuth demo that I wrote a few seconds ago. All right. So that's it's unfortunate, but it is a little too risky, so I'm not going to use solution number one. Solution number two, I like it. I think it's perhaps one of the most maybe mobile friendly or otherwise kind of solutions. So in solution number two, I like it because, I do need a web application or somehow the mobile application or somebody needs to do, talk to GitHub, and the web API. I like solution number two, honestly, in some ways the most, because technically my web API knows everything. And I like that because my web API is like, remember, it's like the store of all the trust in my system. It's where I keep all my trust. Of course, I trust the user, but in the end of the day, it's the API is the one I trust the most. And I like to keep all this information, the client ID, the secret, and everything here. Okay. Unfortunately, because we need a web application or somebody else to talk to GitHub and with the browser, I do need to provide things like client ID, etc., um, to the web application. And then there's a trade-off that Brandon reminded me of, which is that the downside is my web application would have to keep asking the web API for like little tits and bits of information. So to me, in my heart, as a backend developer, primarily, and a really bad front-end developer, but I'm primarily a backend developer. I like solution number two the most. but it does require the front-end developers to constantly contact my API for little bits of information to make this whole thing happen, okay? So this is the solution I would go with if I didn't trust my front end, but that's a little too back-end stubborn, you know? And it's a little bit more complicated because I'd have to have extra routes just to get things like client ID and scope and other things, all right? So ultimately, I think this semester, I am going to go with solution number 3, okay? I'm going to use solution number 3, where the web application is actually the one registered with GitHub, and it does everything with GitHub up to getting the access token. But that's where I stop it. And I tell it, okay, you can get the access token and you can give me, the web API, the access token. But then the web API is the one who's going to ask GitHub to get the actual resources, okay? Why? Because why not just let the application get it? Because the web API ultimately is the one interacting with the database. And I want the web API to trust that what it puts into the database, it knows where it comes from. So for that reason, my solution is a little bit of a hybrid solution this semester. All of the OAuth stuff will happen with the web application, but once I get the token, the application has to pass the token onto the API, and the API will forever get resources and information from GitHub by itself. Okay. So notice it's kind of interesting. One nice thing about an API access token, like we designed at the beginning of today's lecture, is that anybody can use it. GitHub doesn't need to know who is using the access token, right? It knows who it gave the access token to, in this case, my web application, but my web application is free to give any trusted source the access token to do other things, okay? So I'm actually kind of using OAuth to its fullest by saying, okay, I've got the access token and now I will pass it on to my API, and it's my API who will do all the future conversation with GitHub, all right? So this is my solution for this semester. It may not be the one that pleases you the most. For many of us, I think solution number 1 is the most pleasing because it's the simplest, all right? But I don't trust someone else to give me information about the user and say it's from GitHub and I just have to trust them. I would rather talk to GitHub directly and say, hey, GitHub, apparently I'm authorized to ask you for this user's username and email and other things, okay? So I'm going to go with solution number 3. Any other opinions from people about like, no, I really wish we did solution 1 or solution 2 or some other solution? Anybody? So Yenu says, so Yenu asks a question, which is, let me read it out, especially for people on YouTube, which is, why don't we use solution 2 since you said that your heart is, you know, in the API? Well, Yenu, I'll tell you for a couple of reasons. Well, the main reason is the thing I don't like about solution 2 is the thing that Brandon mentioned. This whole thing about the application having to ask the API for the client ID, like it just adds more complication to this whole project. You know, to me, it adds more complication to the whole project. So for this, and actually, honestly, in the years that I've been teaching this class, I have waffled between solution 2 and solution 3. Some semesters I do solution 2, sometimes I do solution 3. Solution 2, Yenu, involves splitting. If you imagine all the code we need to do OAuth, and that's kind of visible in that OAuth demo on a single page, all this code. With solution 2, about half of it would go in the application, half of it would go in the API. So it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of like, in some ways, it's kind of like, it's almost like I don't know which I trust more. I trust both. I have to split my code evenly. So it involved writing a lot of code on the application and a lot of code on the API, and it was like, come on, just pick one. So after many years, I've decided, you know what, I'm just going to go with this solution, which is let the application do everything. Just give my API the API access token, and it will use the API access token for GitHub to get the final information. Okay. There is one more thing, Yenu. There is one more thing. Whose responsibility is all this stuff? From GitHub's point of view, who should it be talking to? Should it be talking to an application or should it be talking to an API? If I was GitHub and I'm giving somebody, I'm accepting like codes and giving tokens and stuff like that. If I was GitHub, my preference would be that I am talking to the entity that is closest to the user as possible. The entity most directly affiliated with the user. And to me, the API is, and I haven't even drawn the user in this picture. The user is over here somewhere, and my API is like it's like 3 steps indirectly tied to the user. And if I was GitHub, I would prefer this authorization happen with an entity that is as close to the user as possible. And in my system, my web application is the only entity that's part of my system that is closest to the user, that's most user facing. The browser is not technically part of my system, that's running on the user's computer, so I don't even have access to that machine. So the only machine that I have that is the closest to the user is a web application. So this is the second reason, Yenu, that I kind of chose in the end, you know what, let the application register itself and GitHub then knows, okay, I have this application. Now, going back to Brandon's initial concern, what if I'm writing like 3 or 4 different applications, right? Like maybe one application is for users, one application is for admins, one application is for a special type of user. Like they all have to have client ID and client secret. You know what, Brandon? I think at the end of the day, that is the best solution. Why? Imagine one of these systems gets hacked into and I can't trust the client ID and secret anymore. I could go to GitHub as a developer and revoke the client ID and secret for one of the applications without banning all my applications, right? So for this reason, I think even though it's more work, I do feel if you're creating multiple applications, basically multiple user experiences, each of them should be registered with GitHub separately so that you have more fine-grained control over which applications client ID and secret to cancel in future if you need to. Otherwise, one application is compromised and I have to like basically cancel the client ID and secret for all my applications. It's a little bit heavy-handed. All right. So yeah, at the end of the day, I decided solution number 3 is the one that's the most faithful to the idea of OAuth, which is I am working with a user to authorize myself with GitHub. So the entity that should do most of the process is the web application. Now, getting resources, if you remember how OAuth works, when you're finally trying to get a resource, GitHub doesn't care what your client ID and secret is anymore. It just says, give me an auth token, give me an access token. So GitHub doesn't expect that the entity asking for resources at the end of the day is the same application. It could be anybody, all right? It has simply authorized a web application to use an access token as it sees fit. So that's why I'm going with solution number 3. I think it's most faithful to the idea that I'm doing a web-based authorization of my application. And remember, my user knows my web application by name. The user doesn't know my web API. In fact, my user and my API and my user never talk to each other. So it'll be a little unfair if it's my web API I'm registering with GitHub, right? Okay. So anyway, at the end of the day, this is the solution I went with. All right. I think it's the most faithful to the idea of a web application getting authorized by the user on GitHub. And it's the application the user is familiar with, the user. But getting resources, I think it's fine for the API to use the access token to get resources later, because that's the whole point of OAuth. You don't need the client ID and secret to get resources later because OAuth doesn't care who asks for the resources, as long as you're using the access token that the authorized application gave you. So I think this is probably the most faithful use of OAuth, okay? Take a little water break and see if anybody has any questions or concerns. Okay, thank you. Yenu says she got it. Okay, all right. All right. I do encourage you, like here's a cool thing. The reason I'm going through all this debate, I could have just started with this slide and said, folks, this is how we're doing it. let's do it. That could have saved us half an hour. The reason I didn't do it is because when you go out into industry, this is the kind of question that there is no textbook to tell you how to do. This is the kind of debate that you have to have with your managers, with your fellow developers, your tech lead. Probably most of you are going to end up being tech leads really quickly. Probably after you've taken my classes, you'll be tech leads within a few years easily. So very likely you are the one who may have to make the decision or consult other people. You need to be able to lay out an argument about the different options and the different solutions and why you're going each way. As a professor, I think I'll be spoon feeding you too much if I just say, solution three, let's do this. This is the best way. I can't say this is the best way. You see all the trade offs now. So, and I'm telling the way I'm going, and you can see how I am not 100% certain, but I have some convictions and some philosophy of why I'm going this way at the end of the day. Okay. And thanks to your great questions, particularly thank you, Brandon and Yenyu, for asking these questions. So, you know, imagine we're in a company and we're a team. This is how I, like if you were one of you or my manager or my tech lead, this is how I would be explaining to you why I'm going this way, even though you see different trade-offs and you see I'm more comfortable with certain things than others. So this is the kind of conversation that I want you to encourage. I want to encourage you to think about having later on in your career. Okay, come up with multiple solutions, draw them out, debate them, think about the technical aspects, think about the philosophy of the protocol, think about all these things in trying to, answer these questions. Okay, great. I'm glad to have this interaction with all of you. So at the end of the day, let's just choose number three. Okay. Now, once again, I think I forgot my assignment description, but I think I'll give you some freedom to pick which way you want to do it. I think this is the most solid way, at least for my application. So this is how we're going to do it. Um, so what's going to happen now is my web application is the one that's going to do all the back and forth with GitHub to do OAuth. It's all going to happen with my web application, and it will give the client ID, secret, and code to get the to get the access token from GitHub. And at the end, once it's gotten the long-term access token, the API access token for GitHub, it will pass it along to my API. And now my API can go ahead, get GitHub information and stuff like that, okay? And then the API can create a user account based on the GitHub information, all right? So let's walk through the code a little bit. There's several slides for the code, but I'll try to give you the basic idea here, okay? So, and this is my implementation. I think some of you could come up with a better implementation, honestly. This is my half-baked implementation, okay? So essentially, here's my web application. It's the one that does everything, including handling the callback from GitHub. All right. So my web application, I've got a little helper function called Google, GitHub GH OAuth URL. So this sets up the URL to where I need to send the user to the browser to do the authorization on GitHub. All right. So it involves the client. It involves the OAuth URL, which this week I don't want to show you my secrets.yaml, but I'll show you my secrets example.yaml. By the way, I think this is a really good practice. I'm not going to show you my secrets.yaml because that actually has some keys in it that I don't want to show you, or some information I don't want to show you. But I keep a file around called secrets example.yaml, which my application doesn't use. But if anybody clones this repo, I give them a starter secrets.yaml. And I provide them even basic things like a message key and a database key. These are not the message key and database key of my production system. These are what I use for development and testing, so I have no problem giving this to somebody cloning my repo. Okay? I don't provide them a SendGrid API access key or anything like that. Okay? All right. So one thing that I do have in my secrets that is I have a GitHub account URL. Sorry, it's a little different from this example code here, but I use that URL to set up this to set up that link to set up this link for GitHub sign-in. So the link that you're seeing down in the bottom, let me see if I can do it like this. So this link that you're seeing down here, I don't know if you can read it on your system. Does it help if I zoom in a little bit? I don't know, maybe a little bit, barely. But basically, this link going to GitHub with the client ID and the scope, this is all set up by my web application, okay? And once the user clicks on that link, they're gone. They've left my system and they go to GitHub. I no longer have access to that browser. It doesn't talk to me again. GitHub does everything with the user from that point on. So GitHub gets the user to sign into GitHub if they haven't signed in already, gets the user to authorize my application if they haven't already, and of course, Credence application is registered with GitHub with the client ID and secret. And then when GitHub is done with the user and the user's authorized my application, it sends the user to my callback URL. And so this week in my web application, I have a URL under auth. So it's like auth/SSO callback, okay? And it comes with a code, all right? And the code is not part of the path of the URL. It's a URL parameter, so I access it using the routing params object, and I access the code, okay? What do I do with the code? I pass it on to a service object, okay? So I pass it on to a service object called authorized GitHub account. What the service object does is it makes the post request to GitHub, says, here's my client ID, here's my secret, here's my code, and it gets back the access token. I'm sorry, when you're actually looking at the code is a little different from what I've written for the new version of HTTP gem and Ruby. So my code will be a little bit different on GitHub. So it gets the access token and it gets that out of the response from the post request. All right. So, so essentially, long story short, my application sends the browser to GitHub. And when GitHub does the callback, my application also makes a final post request with the code from the callback saying, could you please give me my access token? Okay, great. I'm going to change some stuff down here. Please, I apologize. I'll have to change my slides after the class, okay? But that's the big picture story of this. All right. So once I have this access token, then my web application now hands over the responsibility to get the actual GitHub account information to my API. All right. So it calls, so on the left-hand side, this is the code for my web application. On the right-hand side, this is the code for my web API. And my web application now calls my web API, okay? And it calls a route on my web API, which is API v1 auth/SSO. And in the post, it sends a post request saying, I have gotten the access token for a user. Please go ahead and make an account, okay? And I'm passing the access token in the body of the request as JSON, all right? My web API, it does not need a client ID, it does not need a client secret, it does not need a code. It uses, so it comes to this service object called authorized SSO in my web API now. So this is now code for my web API. My web API now calls, oh, sorry, I shouldn't have clicked that. It calls GitHub with the API access token. and says, could you please give me information about a user? Which user? I don't have to tell it because the access token is about that user. You know, the access token identifies that user to GitHub anyway. And GitHub now comes back to me, and in the response, it gives me the account information for the user. All right. And what I do is I have a new model in my GitHub, in my API this week of a model called GitHub account. And all it does is it really takes the information that GitHub gives me and extracts the username and password. So I can use that account to get a username and password, okay? And my route will then create a username and password, okay? It'll do a couple of things. First, it will check if there's already an account with this GitHub email. If there's already an account, I don't have to make a new account. I'll just pull up the account that exists. So think about this for a second. If somebody's already registered with me with a username and password, if they use a single sign-on to log in, I don't create a new account in the database. I just use the GitHub email to find that account. And I say, oh, you're already registered with me. Fine, I'll just treat you like a normal user. Okay. But if I cannot find them in my database, then I ask my account model, please create a new GitHub account. Okay. And let me kind of show you the code for that. All right. So this is the same code in more detail. So this is just my web API now. So this is the route that my web application called with the access token. So I use the access token and I call my service object. Here's that service object, that same service object again. All right. That service object uses the access token to get the information from GitHub. All right. It calls the GitHub account model. The GitHub account model is not a database model. It just parses. All this model does is it parses the information coming back from GitHub and extracts a username and email for me. So I can use that as username and email. Okay. And my service object, once it is kind of excuse me. So my so let's see where's my service object. Okay, so here's my service object. It wait, I'm a little bit lost here. Create. Okay, so after it's gotten the GitHub account information, after it gets the GitHub account information, my service object then says find or create an SSL account. So it tries to find an account in my database which has the email address that GitHub gave it. If it finds an account, it doesn't care if it's an SSO account or a registered account. It says, okay, I found the account. Great, logged in. Let them log in now. Okay. If it cannot find an account, then it asks the account model, please create a new account with this information from GitHub. So in my account model this week, which is a database model, I have a new method called create GitHub account. And it uses the username and email from GitHub to create a new account in the database. Okay. So that's it. That's the story. All right. Let me just kind of run this one time live. Let me just run this so you can see the full interaction. So this is my, let me just kind of sort all this stuff in the right order so you can see what's happening here. All right. So, no, this is my OAuth demo. Let me save that. And let me just, okay. So this is my application. So let me just run this whole thing to show you all of this stuff happening. So here is my application. here is my API. I'm going to just put them the other way around. I'm going to put my application on the left, and I'm going to put my API on the right. That way, it looks more, and let me just make, I don't need to see the code anymore. It looks more like the picture you're seeing down here, okay? So it looks more like this picture with my application on the left and my API on the right, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go find my browser. I'm going to bring it back to this page. I'm just going to like minimize it a little bit, see if I can, so let's see if I can run them both at the same time. All right. Or maybe what I'll do is, let me run my application up on, let me, hold on, oops, terminal. Let me run it a little bit like this. Okay, and I'm gonna just, so you can see my application running, and you can also see the logs from the application on the left and the API on the right. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's try to sign in. So I'm going to go to GitHub, sign in. All right. Hold on. Let me actually first load this login page again. So you see on the left-hand side my application. This is the GET request here to the login page. All right. So I click GitHub to log in, and as soon as I click this link, I'm being sent to GitHub. So I have left this application. My logs don't register anything because I've just been sent to GitHub with a client ID and scope. A little hard to see all that, but the client ID and scope in the URL. Okay. La-di-da. And then I say authorize. Once I authorize, the callback will go to my application on the left. My application will use that the code from the callback to do a post request to get the access token, and then it will send the access token to my API on the right. So it's all going to happen in one shot. Let's keep an eye on it when I click this button. 3, 2, 1. All right. So you see on the left here, the callback happened with a one-time code. Okay, here's my one-time code. By the way, I tried. If you use the code again, GitHub will say bzz. It will not allow you to use it again. So it's really a one-time code. So it got the one-time code, and then it called my API and used the one-time code to get the access token. And then it called my API and said, hey, this is a post request to my API saying, here's the access token. All right. And it used the access token to actually create a new user in my API. So let me, so I've just been sent back to those. So you'll notice my username now is soumyaray@github, because I've set up my system so that I don't check if there's, the way my system works is it just creates an @GitHub. You don't have to do that, but I did that so you can see right here that it's a GitHub username, okay? So if I go into Rake console of my API, you should see that I now have a, let me do this again. This doesn't get bigger. Hold on. Let me run Rake console again. Maybe it'll be a little bit bigger this time. There you go. So you see, this is my GitHub account. So I used @GitHub on it. And here's the email. You'll notice that this user does not have a password. does not have a password. So they actually could never log in with the password in future. And this is a downside of my system. If I ever lost my account on GitHub, I'm locked out of my account because I don't even have a password. So for this reason, some websites, I don't know how many, but maybe few, but some websites, when you do SSO or single sign-on, they still ask you to make a password. Because if you ever lost your account at that single sign-on authority, you could still log in with your password if you wanted. Okay. Now the user cannot log in with a password, but in future, what I could do is I could allow a user who says, "Sorry, I can't log in with GitHub again. I made an account before, but GitHub, I don't have an account on GitHub anymore." In future, what I could do is I could use this email to allow them to create a new password. So I could validate them in future when they say, "I forgot" or "don't have a password," and then I would send them an email here, and they could set up a new password. Okay. I have not done that for this week. All right. Also note, I'm making the username somiarray at GitHub kind of for demonstration purposes. However, I don't have to do it this way. If somebody's already registered with my system, then the single sign-on will not create a new account. It will not create a new account. Instead, it'll just use the account they're already registered with. So even people who have created a username and password, they could also log in with GitHub if they're using the same email on GitHub that they're registered with my website. Okay. Why? Because once again, remember, in the code of my system, I don't force my system to create a new account. Rather, once they've logged in with GitHub, I provide the GitHub account information to this find or create SSO account. And what it does is, before it creates a new account, it checks to see if there's already an account with that email address. And it doesn't care if the account is a GitHub account or a registered account. All right. So even people who registered with a username and email and password, they could also log in with GitHub without providing me an email. All right. I don't discriminate between them. Okay. I only create an account for people who don't have an account yet. Sounds good? So this is the full picture of my system today. You're welcome to ask questions in the chat window or raise your hand if you wish. I welcome all that. But while you're thinking of your questions, this is a full picture of our system as of today. Okay. Wow, it's quite a bit more complicated than maybe some of you thought when you joined the class. All right. It's got, here's all the moving parts, right? We have a user, of course, who we never talk to really directly. They have a browser. The user has a browser. The browser talks to us to content distribution networks to get my CSS styles, scripts, and fonts and stuff like that. By the way, that fancy dancy GitHub, excuse me. Let me go back to this picture. Let me, by the way, even GitHub account people, oh, sorry, I stopped my API from running, so it doesn't know what is going on anymore. Sorry about that. Running my API again. So notice even people with a GitHub account, they also have an API access key. All right, everyone has an API access key. All right. What I wanted to mention is that notice that this login button right here, this picture here of GitHub, it comes from Font Awesome. And Font Awesome is a resource that I get in my web application. So if in my web application, if you go to the layout.slim, oh, where's Font Awesome? Here. So here is where I'm loading the CSS, the style sheet for Font Awesome. I'm using a content distribution network called JS Deliver, which has a project called Fort Awesome, and that has the Font Awesome CSS minified. Min means it's been like the CSS has been made extremely compact, but it's called Font Awesome. I'm using Font Awesome version 5. So Font Awesome is just a CSL style sheet, which comes with some icons and things that I can use. So, excuse me. So this GitHub image, this GitHub logo, brand logo, actually comes from this Font Awesome style sheet. And the way I'm accessing that icon is I have to go to my login window. Here it is. I'm creating a link of class, I'm creating a span object, and the class is FAB, that's Font Awesome, the B is for brand. I'm looking for a Font Awesome icon, that's a brand, and the brand I'm looking for is Font Awesome's GitHub icon. All right. Oops, excuse me. So I'm using one more content distribution network, but I'm using several, one for Bootstrap, one for the theme. My Bootstrap theme is from a different network, or maybe it's a different set of scripts. My fonts come from Font Awesome, so my browser is also acting as CDN, okay? I've got a web application, I've got an API. The API talks to a database. The web application simply stores session information in a session store rather than in a cookie. All I'm storing in the cookie is a session ID number. And my web application uses that session ID number to get the full session information, which is an encrypted information about my account and my auth token. The auth token that is part of my session information has full scope. I can read, write, do whatever I want with it. The API access token that I give to users is a different one with limited scope that I talked about in the beginning of today's class. So my web API is the one that handles policies and scopes and stuff like that. And it's also the one that uses SendGrid to send out emails to the user. Okay. My web application, however, is heavily involved in the single sign-on process with the GitHub API. And it does everything, including the callback, and gets the GitHub code, which it exchanges for a GitHub access token. It then passes the GitHub access token along to my web application, which uses that access token to get account information. It uses that account information to either find an existing account in my database, or if that account doesn't exist, it creates a new account in my database for people trying to log in with GitHub. All right. Great. Riley's asking, do we have any actions with refresh tokens? Unfortunately, as you can see, I'm out of time. I don't have time to talk about refresh tokens. I might touch upon the topic and introduce you to what refresh tokens are. I will not talk about them this week, Riley, so I'm sorry about that. But here's a basic idea. A lot of the time, what you do with access tokens is that you get an access token that expires. So access tokens, like GitHub provides a very long-term access token. It'll last for years. But a lot of websites don't give you a long-term access token. They give you a short-term access token, which maybe expires, I don't know, after a day or a week, maximum a month, but maybe just even after a week. But they provide you with a long-term refresh token. And you can use that refresh token regularly to get a new access token. Okay, so and maybe GitHub has that feature, but I'm not using any refresh tokens. So Riley, I really apologize. I'm not going to have time to talk about refresh tokens in this semester because we're out of the semester. If I had a few more weeks, there's so many topics, including refresh tokens, that I'd like to talk about. Okay, so but I am using long-term access tokens. Other websites give you short-term access tokens and long-term refresh tokens, and you basically get new access tokens with a refresh token. Yenyu is asking, are access tokens stored in Redis and expired in some days? In which part of this workflow do we know that the access token expires and how to deal with the situation? Yeah, Yenyu, what will happen is that the access token for the session information is stored in the session store, and the web application gets it, retrieves it, and gives it to the API every single time. Okay. and the web API with every single request. And the web API constantly opens up this access token to see if it's expired and get the account information. So when it's expired, I don't have to add any new code. The web application will get the access token. It doesn't know that it's expired. The web application has no way of knowing the auth token is expired because it cannot open the auth token. It was encrypted by the web API. It passes the auth token back to the web API, the session auth token. The web API tries to open it and it sees that it's expired and it raises an error. If you look at my code, I check the expiration date in auth token, somewhere in auth token, which is unfortunately also a library. Riley's going to yell at me for in a moment about that. This is the, so I have to go, actually I have to go here and I have to go to the auth token library. Okay. So in my auth token library, you will notice that I have this function called expired. Okay. And whenever my API is trying to read the contents of the token, I first check if it's expired. If it's expired, I raise an expired token error. Okay. So Yenyu, the answer to your question is any request coming in for the web application must provide an auth token. And the API, every single request, it opens up that auth token to see what's inside. And if it's expired, it raises an error, and the web application is told, sorry, I can't give you any information. And the code in a web application basically says, it basically logs you out and redirects you to the login page and makes you log in again. So Yenyu, as far as I know, it's already taken care of. Okay. But do let me know if that's not true for any reason. Do let me know if you find a bug and find that, no, my web application, something, something, something. I think you're talking about the auth token for the session. Yenyu, in case I misread you, if you're asking about the GitHub, are you asking about the GitHub access token or the session auth token? I'm a little confused. Can you unmute yourself and tell me? Yes. Oh, sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Let me answer that question. It's a different question. So Yenyu, when the GitHub access token is expired, notice the GitHub access token is not stored in my session store. Not stored. The GitHub access token is, or is it? Wait, hold on. Where is it? Where is the GitHub access token? Blah 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 blah. Oh, you're right. It is in the session store, I think. No, it's not in the session store. I changed my mind. The GitHub access token is not in the session store. In fact, the GitHub access token is never stored. I only use it once in the login process. Okay. So right now, I am not checking regularly to see if the user has revoked the token yet. Okay. But if the user ever logs out, they won't be able to log back in because that access token would have been expired. All right. So as long as the user doesn't expire it, I'm good to go. But if the user revokes it on GitHub, they have to log out of my system and they can't log in again. All right. Now, a better implementation, which I haven't done for simplicity's sake. This is maybe a mistake on my part, but it's also simplification on my part, is perhaps with every single request to the API from the web application, maybe I should access GitHub and ask, hey, is this access token still valid? Is this access token still valid? Is this access token still valid? Like, I could do it that way, but I don't want to do it that way. I am totally okay with somebody like, I only use the access token to create an account. All right. So right now, I don't care if you delete your GitHub account, revoke the access token later. I don't care. Once you've logged in, I have you as a user and you're forever a user in my system until you log out again. Okay? Okay. All right. That's my own how should I say? That's my own decision, if you will. Okay. All right. Um, any other questions? All right. Okay. So with that, let me just kind of conclude by saying this is the last week, unfortunately, to talk about authorization. I have so much stuff to say. I love authorization is my favorite part of security, honestly. But unfortunately, that brings us to the end of authorization. There are so many more topics I'd like to talk about. So today we've talked about how to use API, how to generate API access keys for our own application. Notice our application does not allow people to get API access keys through a single sign-in process. Okay. Um, Instead, users have to log in and get the API access key through their account details. However, I am using single sign-on with GitHub, so I'm showing you single sign-on the other way around when I'm using somebody else as an SSO provider to get their API access token. All right, so you've seen the API access token from both sides. However, I've not shown you how to implement SSO on our own system, and I won't do that. I think you know enough that you could get it going by yourself if you're savvy enough, okay? The only thing I really haven't talked about is refresh tokens. Riley's asking, could we have a workshop on refresh tokens? You know, that's not a bad idea, Riley. However, I don't think I'm going to do that this semester because I want you to all focus on just getting your applications finished up. Okay. Um, Maybe next semester if I think about it. Yeah, Edgar says, sorry, can't have pizzas if we do it virtually either. And who's going to attend a workshop without pizza? Come on. All right. Riley, I'll make a deal with you. If we need to do refresh tokens for one of maybe your thesis project or one of the projects you and I are working on, maybe I'll make a refresh token workshop, like a really short one, like just like a 40-minute refresh token workshop, a very high level view of how refresh tokens are used. And then if I do that, then I will send out an invitation to all the students of this semester's security class if I have a workshop, but it will not be in the coming 2 weeks. It'll be either in the summertime or next semester. Okay. So Rally, stick on me with refresh tokens. One of the great things that I've had is I have some insight into refresh tokens because students who have taken my class, they've contacted me like in the year after they graduated, previous years, and they told me, "Hey, professor, I want to talk to you about refresh tokens because in my company we're using that, and we have a great discussion." So I've had a lot of back and forth with alumni of this class about refresh tokens. So maybe I can share some of that with you before I forget it as well. And maybe I could even invite one of those alumni back to talk about refresh tokens. So Riley, that's a great idea for a follow-up workshop, but it might be over the summer or next semester. Okay. In which case I would open it up potentially to all the alumni of who have ever taken this class. So the last 7, 8 years of service security students are welcome to come back for a workshop like that. Okay, so that's a great idea for next semester. All right, excellent. Okay, if there's no other questions, let's leave it at that. I'm so sad that I cannot say more about authorization. Like some of the coolest stuff I know about authorization is not covered in this semester. Boo! But it has to be that way. All right. The last thing remaining is this. We have two weak points in our system that I'll talk about next week. One is right now, our API unconditionally trusts my web application. When my web application says, here's an access token for GitHub, or here's a username and password, or here's some registration information, my API says, sure, it trusts my API. It has no way of knowing, my API trusts my application. It has no way of knowing who it's really talking to. So if you look at my code for this, when I publish my code for this week, all my routes in my API require authorization except for login and registration. Login and registration, I just implicitly accept whatever my web application tells me because I don't have an auth token yet because there's no user yet, right? So I can't have an auth token for those two routes because the user hasn't even logged in yet. So that's a weakness because anybody could come to my system and say, hey, could you make a new account for me? And I would do it, you know. Next week, I want to talk about how can we generate some trust between just my API and my application, even when there's no user in the picture. That's one thing. The other weakness in my system is the browser. The browser can do a lot of crazy things, and there's a lot of ways to damage my system and attack my system. And I'll talk about things like cross-site scripting attacks next week. So we have to secure our browser. And as you're going to see next week, there's a lot of control you can have over the browser as a backend developer even. So we'll talk about that next week. Um, yeah, Brandon is asking about admin roles. I'm not going to have time this semester to talk about admin roles. However, Brandon, was it Brandon or Bijan who asked me that question just now? Um, so I'm not going to talk about Brandon. I'm not going to talk about admin roles. However, one of the reasons I just showed you how to do scopes is that you can now use the idea of scopes. You can extend that auth scope thing to have like an admin profile. I'll let you imagine how you can use scopes to create like some kind of admin profile. Somebody who can delete and create accounts, not just projects. Okay, so so that's the basic idea. All right. And again, Brandon, that could be again a great discussion for a separate workshop. Or if you're doing it for your own project for some other thing, we could talk about that. But the idea of auth scopes I showed you, you could use that for admins. You could use, for example, admins would have privilege to maybe read and write documents, read and write projects, and also maybe read and write accounts. So we could extend the auth scope idea a little bit further to create a scope that seems to cover admin privileges. Okay. Okay. And yes, we should probably seed our database with an admin account, which I haven't done, nor have I showed you how to do it. Apologies. Okay. Again, like I said, there's so much stuff about authorization I want to talk to. I should have just a whole class called security authorization, and I can get it all off my chest one day. All right. All right. Okay. I'll let you all go. Thank you all so much. Um, Brandon says admins might require redesign of the DB schema. Yes, Brandon, we would probably need some kind of column in the account database to tell us who the admins are. Okay. Or else, another thought, we have another completely separate account database just for admins, and admins cannot have their own projects and documents. All right. So that's another way to go about it. All right. Sorry, there's too many choices here. All right. Okay. All right. I will let everyone go now. Feel free to type in any last minute questions, but I'm going to end the stream now. And thank you, everyone, for our last heavy session. We will have a light one more lecture, though, with some coding about about creating trust between the API and the application and browser-side security next week. Okay. All right. Thank you all so much. I'm going to